What do you even say after a weekend like that in NASCAR? Sometimes you can feel a race changing before it actually happens. Lap after lap, the pressure builds, the pack gets tighter, the moves get bolder, and there is this uneasy sense that one small mistake is going to trigger something huge. That was the feeling at Talladega, and when the moment finally came, it did more than destroy a race. It opened the door to two much bigger conversations about the current state of superspeedway racing and where NASCAR may be heading if nothing changes. Because what happened out there was not just another dramatic Talladega wreck. It felt like a warning sign. Yes, chaos has always been part of superspeedway racing. Yes, the big one is something every fan expects and every driver fears. But this one felt different, not because it was shocking, but because it was almost predictable. That is what makes it so important. When disaster starts to feel inevitable instead of accidental, that is when the sport has to take a hard look at itself. The race had all the ingredients that make Talladega unforgettable. The field was packed tightly together, lines were moving fast, and drivers were locked into that constant battle between aggression and survival. Nobody wants to give up momentum, nobody wants to lose track position, and nobody wants to be the driver who lifts at the wrong time. On these tracks, every move matters. But the problem is that the margin for error has become so small that even normal racing contact can turn into total destruction in an instant. That is exactly what happened when the massive multi-car crash broke out and erased a huge portion of the field. Bubba Wallace was right near the front, exactly where every driver wants to be and exactly where things can go wrong the fastest. In superspeedway racing, being up front does not always mean being safe. Sometimes it means you are the first domino. One push comes at the wrong angle, one car gets unsettled for half a second, and suddenly there is nowhere to go for anyone behind them. That chain reaction happened in a flash, and just like that, the race changed completely. What stands out most is that people inside the sport are not brushing this off as random Talladega chaos. There is a growing sense that these wrecks are no longer just part of the environment. They are becoming a symptom of the way the current package forces drivers to race. Kevin Harvick made that point clearly when talking about how every push in the pack has to be almost perfect. That is true, but it also raises a bigger issue. If racing at this level now demands near perfection every second just to avoid disaster, then maybe the balance has shifted too far away from driver control. That is what makes this conversation more serious than the average post-race reaction. Fans love intensity. Drivers understand risk. NASCAR has always lived on the edge of speed and consequence. But there is a difference between thrilling competition and a style of racing where drivers feel trapped into making moves they do not fully control. And right now, that line looks thinner than ever on superspeedways. One of the teams hit hardest by the crash was RFK Racing. Their day was essentially destroyed in seconds, and that matters beyond one bad finish. A wreck like this does not just ruin a race result. It affects momentum, points, confidence, and the rhythm a team builds over several weeks. When multiple strong entries are wiped out in one incident, the impact spreads far beyond that one replay fans keep watching. It changes storylines, standings, and playoff pressure. That is why these wrecks carry weight even after the smoke clears. And then there is the deeper frustration coming from the drivers themselves. This is not just disappointment over being caught in a crash. It is frustration with the nature of the racing. Superspeedways have always required trust, precision, and nerve, but the current version often looks like drivers are spending more time reacting than creating. They are not simply choosing their moments. They are being forced into a system where lifting hurts, hanging back hurts, and refusing to push almost guarantees you lose ground. That creates a dangerous cycle where everyone keeps escalating because nobody feels like they can afford not to. A lot of that discussion leads back to the next-gen car. The car has changed the way momentum works on superspeedways, and many drivers seem to believe that it has reduced their ability to recover once things start going wrong. If the car gets unstable in traffic, or if a push lands slightly off-center, there may not be enough time or enough control to save it. That is a major concern because it means the system itself may be amplifying small mistakes into race-ending disasters. When that becomes the norm, the question is no longer whether big crashes will happen. The question becomes how often. That brings us to the second major storyline, and in some ways, it may be the more revealing one. After the race, Bubba Wallace did something that immediately stood out. Instead of unloading blame on another driver or making the wreck entirely about what happened behind him, he took some responsibility himself. He talked about needing to understand how to receive pushes better and admitted that the car was manageable up to a point, but that the final contact may simply have been too much. That response says a lot, and it deserves respect. It is not easy for a driver to speak that honestly after being turned in a wreck that ends his day and takes out a huge part of the field. Most people in that position would focus on the contact, the timing, or the driver behind them. Wallace did not avoid those realities, but he also acknowledged that this is not always as simple as blaming one person. In doing that, he actually highlighted the real issue more clearly than if he had just pointed fingers. Ross Chastain was the driver behind Wallace when the move unfolded, and the push he delivered set off the chain reaction. That is the kind of moment people immediately analyze from every angle, and naturally, opinions will differ on whether it was too aggressive, slightly mistimed, or simply the kind of push that happens all the time until it suddenly goes wrong. But that is the point. These are routine actions in superspeedway racing now. Drivers are expected to make them. The race almost demands it. And because of that, the difference between a strong move and a disastrous one can be measured in inches. Once Wallace got turned, everything behind him collapsed into the kind of scene that has become all too familiar at these tracks. Cars spinning, smoke covering the racing surface, drivers with no visibility and nowhere to escape. In a matter of seconds, a long list of major names was caught in the wreck, including contenders, proven winners, and drivers with real playoff potential. That is what gives this crash such a heavy feel. This was not one isolated incident taking out a few mid-pack cars. This was a moment that reached across the field and altered the race for teams that had every reason to believe they could leave Talladega with something meaningful. For Wallace, the result was especially frustrating because he has shown real speed and confidence on superspeedways before. These are the kinds of races where he often looks capable of contending deep into the final stage. To come in expecting opportunity and leave with a DNF is hard enough. To then become the center of another debate about superspeedway racing adds another layer entirely. But the way he handled it helped shift the conversation away from simple blame and towards something more important: the possibility that the racing product itself is creating impossible situations. That is where this weekend really becomes bigger than one wreck. It is about a pattern. Superspeedway races still deliver drama, wild finishes, and unforgettable moments, but they are also producing wrecks that now feel built into the format. Fans are beginning to expect them. Drivers are speaking more openly about how little room they have. Analysts are questioning whether precision alone can solve a problem that may be structural. And once all of those voices start pointing in the same direction, NASCAR has to listen. The hard part is that there is no easy fix. Nobody wants Talladega and Daytona to lose what makes them special. The unpredictability is part of the appeal. The giant runs, the pack intensity, the feeling that everything can change in one lap, that is why fans keep coming back. But the sport also has to ask whether the current version is leaning too far into survival and too far away from control. If drivers are essentially hanging on and trusting the car behind them more than their own, then that is not just thrilling racing. That is a warning about imbalance. At some point, NASCAR has to decide how it wants these races to be remembered. Does it want fans talking about bold drafting decisions, disciplined teamwork, and elite car control? Or is it comfortable with a version of superspeedway racing where half the field can disappear in a cloud of smoke because one push was a fraction too strong? Those are very different identities for the sport, and right now, it feels like the second one is showing up too often. That is why this weekend matters. It was not only about a 26-car wreck, it was about what that wreck revealed. It showed how fragile the current superspeedway formula has become. It showed how even experienced drivers can get trapped in situations with almost no room to recover. And it showed that some of the people inside the sport are no longer treating these moments as unavoidable fate. They are starting to question whether the product itself is asking too much from the drivers and giving too little back in control. As fans, that is the conversation worth paying attention to now. The crash was spectacular in the worst possible way, but the bigger story is what comes next. Will NASCAR treat this as just another Talladega incident and move on? Or will it start asking harder questions about the current package, the level of aggression it encourages, and the kind of racing it is really producing on superspeedways? Because the truth is, the sport may be reaching a turning point. The intensity is still there. The excitement is still there. But when chaos starts feeling routine, and when drivers themselves sound more concerned than surprised, that is when the balance may be drifting in the wrong direction. Talladega always pushes the limits, but this time it felt like the limits pushed back. And if that keeps happening, this will not be the last time NASCAR is forced to confront what superspeedway racing has become.